Dinner was an hour and a half long, twice monthly, and a privilege every one of them regarded as theirs by right. Fabian enjoyed it, grudgingly. He had once suggested to the others that they should be more grateful. They had the privilege by an accident of history. There was nothing tangible that separated him and his fellows from everyone else. He had pointed out the drudges that waited their tables. "We could have been one of them," he had said, "if but one thing in our ancestors' lives had been different." His colleagues had been outraged, some of them delightfully outraged, because they enjoyed to shout and flutter, but outraged nonetheless. "Things are the way they are according to the will of the Emperor," they'd said, or variations on that theme. Fabian had said it for devilment at the time, but he wasn't so sure now. Too much reading, he rebuked himself. There was a worm eating at him, like the parchment weevils chewing their way through the wisdom of ages in the archivist's tower. He couldn't stop thinking about the Primarch. His food tasted worse than it usually did. Indigestion burned at his gullet, making him surly. "To another fine week of evaluations, gentle sirs," Dimius Wint declaimed. He was acting toastmaster of their table. He was a creature of great self-regard, his robes embroidered at his own expense with patterns that pushed at the edges of the rules regarding such things. His neck was swaddled in a grubby three-tiered ruff. He acted as if they dined at the Emperor's own table, though theirs was only one of many, there being several hundred in the Grand Senatio. "To the glory of the Emperor and his eternal Imperium, we who rule the stars by right salute our Lord and give thanks for our service," Wint bellowed. The Senatio rang with competing protestations of devotion. The noise reached unbearable levels as the toastmasters toasted and the diners responded. "The Emperor protects," Bo Fosden said. "Imperium eternal," Jal Hissapar proclaimed. Glasses of harsh spirit were lifted and drained as the acclamations were given, and the men sought to outdo each other in their piety. Fabian's head throbbed. "You make no acclamation, Sir Gelfrain?" said Wint. "For the Emperor," he said, quietly, raising his glass. Some of the others tutted. "You do not stand. You do not shout. That is a lack of enthusiasm," Wint scolded. "Forgive me," said Fabian. His temper had been poor all day, and finally broke. He threw his threadbare napkin down onto his plate. "I find my enthusiasm waning of late. Terror is in strife, and war besets the Imperium on every front, and yet we sit and we eat as if nothing has happened." "Everyone must sit and eat sometime, Gelfrain," Bo Fosden said. Fosden's neighbour, a man Gelfrain only knew by sight, nodded in exaggerated agreement. "They must, but they need not do it marinated in the juices of self-satisfaction." "Careful there, Gelfrain," said Wint. He sat heavily and helped himself to more food. "You speak as if the Imperium is in difficulty." "Whereas you, Wint, speak as if it is enjoying the heights of triumph," Fabian responded. "I have heard that much of terror is in open revolt. The effects of the days of blindness will last for generations. We were in no good state before. Look at us." He flapped his hand at their accoutrements. "Our settings are fine, but the food is the same nutrient cubes we're served every day, and which all other inhabitants of this sector eat. All these items are old, most are damaged or ruined." He tapped his chipped glass. "Is this the sign of an empire in rude health, or one in deep decline? You sit here and praise the past without understanding it, while the present burns beyond the palace walls." "Not this again," Jal Hissapar complained amiably. "You always ruin dinner, Gelfrain. Let's talk about something else." His attempt to change the subject failed. "There have never been any empires like ours," said Wint. "It is eternal." "What about what came before? Before the Emperor," said Fabian. He charged headlong into dangerous territory. He should have stopped, but anger propelled him. "The existence of other empires is hearsay and legends spread by traitors," a thin man named Bascus said. "The Imperium always has been and always shall be." Bascus raised his glass. "Imperium eternal," he said. "Imperium eternal," the others shouted. "That's not true," Fabian said. "There have been others. Don't you think they all thought their rule would last forever? Do you think they had to face anything like we're facing now?" "This is false talk," said Wint. "It is true," said Fabian. "Where do you read this, Fabian?" Gwilliam Dran said this, an adept Fabian deeply disliked. "We have the materials if you choose to look at them, Gwilliam. It is all there in our libraries. We have become blind and indolent. You are becoming a heretic. There is no place in the great machine for broken components." "Fine," said Fabian. He stood up suddenly, making his chair rock. He was giddy with anger. "This broken component is leaving." He struggled to maintain his dignity, but couldn't, and whirled about and stabbed his finger. "I have few pleasures in life. I look forward to saying I told you so." "Did he just wish the end of the Imperium?" Bascus said in shock. It could be looked at that way, thought Fabian, which means it probably will be. "Morons," he said. "Buffoons! Pinheads!" He pronounced very loudly and very clearly as he stormed out. "I will report you," shouted Wyant after him. "The priests will hear of this, and the departmental scrutineers." Fabian forced his way past the chairs of his fellow adepts. A sudden and uncontrollable loathing came over him, the way they gawped, the way they thought, the way they smelled. But already fear was worming itself into his mind, and he was formulating what he would say to dig himself out of the mess he'd made by the time he made it to the ornate, flaking doors of the dining hall. The menials bowed and opened them, but they'd heard too, and were horrified. He was such a fool. The enormity of what he had done hit him as he made his way back to his domiciliary tabularum. All his colleagues from his gallery were in the Senatio, so his own level was quiet on both sides of the open atrium. His legs were shaking now the adrenaline was leaving him, and he stopped to gather his breath and his thoughts. He gripped the tarnished gallery rail. Eagles, imperial eyes, and the stylized quill of his departmento decorated wrought iron panels. They were spotted with rust. Verdigris and thick deposits of polish collected around the rivets of the railings. In places, the hollow brass had been worn right the way through. It was all so old. Movement in the hive had bent it out of true. There was a glass ceiling full of cracked panes, but it was opaque with accretions of dirt, and Fabian had no idea what was on the other side. It could be the sky, for all he knew. More likely, it was the underside of another miserable departmento. That struck him as depressingly funny, and he snorted. He ran his ring of office on the brass rail. "All will be fine," he reassured himself. He pushed himself away and headed back down to his quarters. All will be fine. He was sure all would be fine, right until he pushed open the door. There, things were far from fine. There were papers all over the floor of the anteroom. Rasilisu's bedding had been pulled out of its hiding place and shredded. His eyes followed the trail of destruction through the open inner door into his office, finding a booted foot there and following it up a leg to the man who owned it. The man was sitting on his desk, braced on the ground by one foot, the ankle of his other leg crossed to rest on the thigh. Fabian tensed. This was it then. They had come for him. But that didn't seem to matter. What infuriated him was that his papers were in disarray, scattered all over the carpet, his bookshelves ransacked. He was so incensed he only saw what the man was reading a moment later. When he did, his bowels turned to water. The man wore a uniform he didn't recognize. It was military in cut, with simple trousers and a well-fitted tunic, but his insignia said he was part of the Adeptus Administratum, though his departmento badges were obscure. In general, the man had a military air. His hair was well cut, his face shaved smooth. He was young, too, Fabian thought. The man smiled at him and snapped the book shut with a dull thump as damning and final as the slamming of a dungeon door. "You could get into a great deal of trouble for writing this," he said, holding out Fabian's personal journal. "Who are you?" Fabian said. The man shook his head. "A bit of defiance isn't going to do you any good. Do you know what? I'm going to rephrase what I just said." He let his other boot thump onto the floor and stood up. He was well muscled under his uniform and had a black las pistol holstered at his hip. "You are in a great deal of trouble." After that, events proceeded in a blur. More men came, carrying guns and wearing armor. Fabian sat helplessly on his desk while they tore through his things. "Who are you?" he asked, as his office was thoroughly upended. "Germain Gunther," said the young man, as he smashed in paneling and had his minions rip out the cabling and pipes behind. "You won't find anything in there," said Fabian. "It was all in there. You've got everything." He raised his hand to point at his secret compartment. A warrior took his hand and forced it down so he could cuff his wrists. "You can't be too careful in these matters." Germain looked up from the dark spaces. "Or any matter." He pushed his hair from his eyes and directed an armed goon to smash in another panel with his lasgun butt. "I confess." "It won't do you any good," Gunther said cheerfully. "Then tell me what departmento you're with." "I'm not. I'm a logister," Gunther said, though in that exact moment he seemed to be nothing other than an enthusiastic thug. "Our departmento is a new one, formed by the Primarch himself to oversee the formation and supply of his crusade fleets, the Officio Logisticarum." He gave a little bow. "But you look like military." "You're not as stupid, man," said Gunther. He tapped his collar pins. "We wouldn't be here if you were stupid." "You look like the Astra Militarum," said Fabian. "You're still being stupid." Gunther pointed away from the desk. Fabian stood up. Gunther waved him to the side. "Thanks," said Gunther, then heaved Fabian's desk over with a massive crash. "We have to be thorough here." Gunther beckoned over a couple of men. "We're leaving. Get some of the locals to come in here and clean up. Make sure they see the mess." Fabian looked down at his life's work. "You're not even going to search it?" "Not the point. You're coming with me. Anything in here you want to keep? You're not coming back." "What?" Gunther rolled his eyes and sighed. "Right. I appreciate you are undergoing a profound amount of shock right now, but it wasn't a difficult question. Is there anything you want to keep?" he repeated slowly. "Aren't I going to be punished?" "My friend, if you think what's lined up for you isn't punishment, then the file notes on your intelligence level are woefully in error." He grabbed Fabian under the arm. "Last chance. Anything?" "Where's Rasilisu? Bring him to me. I'll take him." Gunther frowned. "That old fossil of a servant?" "His family has been in my family for 46 generations. What would he do without me?" "I don't know. A little dance that he doesn't have to put up with such asinine questions?" "Please." Fine. We'll find him. You can keep him. Men," he called, "we return to the upper palace." He said this with an ostentatious flourish of his free hand. "Bring the books." The crashing and breaking stopped. Gunther's squad lined up behind their leader. "Are you a man who enjoys his work?" said Fabian acidly. Gunther shrugged. "Come on." He gripped Fabian's arm more tightly and propelled him out of the door. "We've people to frighten with the parading of the wicked heretic." "That's you," he whispered. "My emperor, you are in bother," he said. Fabian was taken out through the main entrance to the gallery, which more officials of the Logisticarum barred to his clansmen. They clustered outside, their shrill gossiping coming to a sudden silence when Fabian appeared. The adepts were cowards to a man and drew back as swiftly when Gunther pushed Fabian through them. Fearful whispers were exchanged behind raised hands. "They're going to be very productive for the next few months," said Gunther, as they pushed past and out into the Whispering Walk, the way that cut between Fabian's atrium and another, identical facility half a mile away. "They don't seem to like you. What did you do to them?" "I made a bit of a show of myself at dinner time," Fabian said. "Really?" Gunther's eyes widened in a way that Fabian found hard to read. The Logister was either genuinely surprised or mocking him deeply. He thought he could guess which. "You're mocking me." "All hurt, are we, heretic?" said Gunther. They came out into a parking area for official grounders. The departmento had 24 spaces, but only a single battered official vehicle to fill them. Next to the departmento's last vehicle, as if there weren't 22 other spaces it could have occupied, was a large jet-black armoured personnel carrier. Fabian was bundled through the side doors into an interior drenched ruby red by dim lumens. "Now," said Gunther, sitting down next to Fabian. The troopers, or logisters, whatever they were, settled in around them on the benches running down either side of the compartment. "Have you never heard the expression, 'Scribe, that no matter who you are, you will not be missed'? You are an intelligent enough man to see that statement has two meanings. You are about to discover the truth of them both. Good night." "Good night," said Fabian. Gunther stuck a needle in his neck. "I'm sure that file of yours is way off," he said. Fabian opened his mouth to protest, but only a soft moan escaped, and he fell deep into drugged sleep. Fabian came awake with the last thing he had on his mind on the tip of his tongue, whence it leapt without prompting. It was very rude and biological. A man who was not Jermaine Gunther responded. "You are awake, then?" When Fabian saw who had spoken, the strength fled his body. A squirming terror wrapped itself savagely about his bladder and bowels and squeezed. "Forgive me, my lord," he gasped. "Lord Rabute Gilliman, the Lord Commander of the Imperium of Man, the Imperial Regent, the returned Primarch of the Ultramarines, the Patrician, the Avenging Son, the living, breathing offspring of the God Emperor himself," looked at Fabian with a neutral expression for an eternal second. "I've been called worse," he said. "Now, take a moment. Breathe. The drug Jermaine used on you is rapid acting and will wear off quickly. Wait to speak until its influence is gone. Then we may discourse as civilized men." Man was too small a word for the Primarch. The galaxy was too small a place for him. Gilliman would have been big without his armor on. As he was, garbed for battle, he was the size of a tank. Various components of his warsuit rested on a stand behind him. The huge gauntlet with its underslung weapons, the ammo hoppers and feeds, the outer plates of his pauldrons, and the great golden eagle with its halo that sat over his backpack had all been removed, but he retained the rest, though he stood at a gargantuan desk. Fabian imagined him part disarming before remembering he had no time and setting himself to work. His enormous sword, the Emperor's sword, Fabian reminded himself with a fresh spurt of fear, hung sheathed from hooks on the wall. In its place, Gilliman had taken up a pen. "Take your time," Gilliman said, and returned to the pile of documents in front of him. Fabian looked around, dazedly. The room was enormous, everything in it except the chair Fabian sat in made for a giant statue. The ceilings were high and painted with battle scenes. The walls were black stone, decorated with flowing details, pilasters, garlands of leaves, angels, and all manner of things picked out in gold and polished to a high luster. It was also empty of anything but data. There was Fabian and his chair, and Gilliman. Then the desk between them. If that had been the sum of it, the picture would have been one of high imperial majesty. Yet into this perfect place disarray had come. Shelves stood in ranks like soldiers at attention, dipping under the weight of their contents. Then there were the stacks of books and data slates piled up on the desk, and more scattered across the floor. The Primarch didn't look like he belonged there. He looked like a mocking art installation, a model demigod placed amid heaps of trash. It could not be real, thought Fabian. It was a drug, machine, or witch-induced fantasy. Maybe he was being interrogated or tested. He lifted his hands. They were unchained. They looked real enough. He poked himself. Gilliman continued to work, consulting multiple active slates and reading scrolls and books at the same time. Very occasionally his pen moved, but it made no sound on the active glass of his slate. Fabian felt pleased to notice that. He was so stupefied by what was happening, he was seeing the ordinary and thinking it remarkable. He was in danger of losing his mind. He half rose, then thought better of it. He cleared his throat. "My lord?" His voice was an embarrassing warble. Gilliman looked at him. His death wound was visible, a rope-thick scar that protruded from beneath his neck seal. "You are ready?" "I think so," said Fabian. "Then listen," said Gilliman. He put down his pen. "When we are done, you will be taken from here and given refreshments. I apologize if you are hungry or thirsty now, but time is of the essence. I am sorry I do not have much time for you at this moment. The demands of the crusade are great, but please understand that everything I am going to say and what I am going to ask of you is very important to me. Consider this fact above all others before giving me any sort of response. Do you understand?" Fabian's tongue refused to move, so he nodded. Gilliman took in a deep breath. In the recesses of his armor were many small lights. Some of these burned more brightly when he breathed in. Others pulsed in time with his heartbeat. I have been dead for over 9,000 years, said Rabute Gilliman. The galaxy has changed, and I do not like what I see. The Emperor had a dream, Adept Gelfrain, and it died when I did. Fabian's head was spinning. Gilliman was the son of God. Fabian was sitting in the same room as the Son of God. The realization pummeled him. The Primarch's presence was overwhelming. Gilliman looked like a man, but he wasn't a man. He could never be a man. He wore the shape of a man, but he was a sun, a tempest, the universe clad in flesh. Fabian made himself listen, to try to understand, when all he wanted to do was throw himself onto his knees and beg for mercy. After Horus's defeat and the Emperor's installation upon the Golden Throne, Gilliman continued, I tried my best to enact measures to ensure the Imperium would not deteriorate further. Though I believe the Emperor's ambitions could never be fully achieved, now he was no longer with us, I thought we could save what we had. It is difficult to follow a plan you only half know. He never told any of us the extent of it anyway. From 18 successful suns, he told not a single one all of it. Fabian could hold Gilliman's gaze for about half a second, but he kept looking up, increasing the amount of time by tiny increments. He had the strange feeling the Primarch was challenging him. 18 suns. There were 9 holy Primarchs. 9. He wanted to yell, then laugh. He held his teeth closed. His head spun. I have much to do, but I will win this war, and when I have done so, things are going to change. We can no longer go on as we have. The past decays, no matter how hard you work to preserve it. It is time for the Imperium to look forward again. Gilliman paused. I am going to ask you to help me. Much has been lost. Records are frustratingly incomplete. In many cases, they are fabricated or deliberately suppressed. During the time the Emperor walked with us, most of human history was uncovered. This has been forgotten again. Yet another lacuna in the sum of human knowledge that I must refill. I am establishing a small cadre of individuals to do this, to document the coming crusade, and to piece together what happened, as truthfully as is humanly possible, while I sat powerless on the crag. Gilliman's voice was strong and pure, though a slight catch suggested his wound had cut into his larynx. Far from ruining his voice, this imperfection only highlighted how perfect it was. It was deep, resonant, the kind of voice that made one listen, neither strident nor loud, and carefully used. The Primarch paused to make sure Fabian understood, though not so frequently as to make him feel patronized, and left openings so the adept might ask questions should he need to. Despite his gentle manners, listening to Gilliman was akin to Fabian sticking his head into a ringing bell. The words reverberated around his head, shook his guts. Gilliman might have spoken measuredly, his voice might have been perfect, but it was also pitiless, the march of 1,000,000 soldiers into the undefended hinterlands of Fabian's mind. Fabian had never truly thought about his soul before, but he could feel it now, shivering inside him. He blanched, fighting back nausea. I read these books from the past 10 millennia, the Primarch said, waving his hand over the desk. And I cannot trust them. I must know what happened, why, and when, so that when I formulate a new system of government, it will perform correctly. He looked at Fabian seriously. Fabian's entire body shook with the effort of holding his gaze. I have failed in many of the tasks the Emperor set me. The state of the imperial governance is the most egregious of those failures. We must put this right. Fabian goggled. Me, he tried to say, but he couldn't. He could barely blink. He was as helpless as prey before a serpent. Gilliman's voice thundered in his mind louder than the drums of war, compelling him to agree, compelling him to obey. This couldn't be real. His mind screamed. Gilliman made a small gesture. There will be 4 of you, to begin with. When I have the time, I will confer with you. I will instruct you in the methods and techniques you are to use. He rested his giant armored hand on a thick book. After a period of 3 months' acclimatization, you will each be given others to train. This is only the beginning. Do not fail me. He paused. Now, if you have any questions, ask them. Fabian swallowed. The cessation of the Primarch's voice was a blessed relief. Gilliman waited. "Nothing?" he said, in a way that suggested he knew Fabian wanted to speak but couldn't. "You're not going to ask me if I want to do it?" he panted. Gilliman raised an eyebrow. "That is not the first question I would ask were I in your position," the Primarch said. "Do you think you can refuse?" What if I did? The thought of being enthralled to that voice was terrifying. "You would go back to where you came from. I believe you have been accused of a number of crimes according to the Lex Minoris statutes applicable to your office." He made a show of flipping over a plastic flimsy. 7, in fact. You were quite clever, but careless, and you offended your colleagues. He let the flimsy drop. "This is why you were caught. You will be sent back to face justice if you refuse." "Then I accept," Fabian said feebly. "Then is there anything else I can answer for you? Germain will give you details of your duties and show you to your new quarters." "Why me?" "That is the question I expected you to ask," said Gilliman. "Your histories show talent for this kind of work. You have an inquiring mind. You are curious. These qualities are extremely rare." "But there are trillions of people in the Imperium, maybe more," said Fabian. I don't know how many humans there are in the galaxy, but there are a lot," he said, cringing inwardly at how stupid he sounded. "You could have asked any of them." "Call it providence. Call it the will of the Emperor. But I saw you on the day of the Battle of the Lion's Gate." "You remember that?" "Among my many gifts is perfect recall," said Gilliman levelly. "I am a Primarch. I remember everything." "Ah," said Fabian. "Because you saw me. That's why." He was surprised. "Not entirely. A few weeks later, your file was passed to me when I began my search for my first historitors. In your journals, you called yourself a historian. You showed some raw talent. That you assembled what you did from the sources you had impressed me. So many volumes produced in such little time to such a high standard. You show an ability for fast, competent work, a little over-adorned for my tastes, but well written." "You read my books?" "Nothing goes unnoticed," said the Primarch. "I am no believer in serendipity, Fabian, but sometimes it appears that fate emerges to make our lives a little easier. Yes, I could have chosen any one of billions. Even now, in this dark Imperium time has carved from the bones of the Emperor's ambitions, there are free thinkers and radicals who dare to question, and many of them have more talent than you. But you are here, and they are not. That is why." Fabian stood there with his mouth open. He had to gasp a couple of times before he could speak. His lungs felt too shallow to provide him with adequate air. "Because? That's your answer," said Fabian. Disbelief undermined his fear. The Primarch frowned. "I see you are as unbound by convention as your files suggest. You address a Primarch in a tone of incredulousness," he said sternly. "This trait is beneficial some of the time, as I have little use for servile behavior and would prefer a certain directness from those who report to me. However, I suggest you learn quickly the occasions when it is not beneficial." He gave a meaningful stare that nearly floored Fabian. "That is all we have time for. I am, as you will understand, exceedingly occupied." The doors opened. Germain Gunther waited in the opening. 2 immense space marines in ornately decorated armor stood at attention either side. "We will speak again," said Gilliman. Fabian gathered his wits. "Thank you, Lord," he said, and bowed, and backed away. "It seems you are a fast learner," said Gilliman, already absorbed by his multiple information sources. "That is also good." He said no more. Fabian staggered out. Gunther took his arm gently and helped him walk. "It does get easier," he whispered, close to his ear. Fabian could only nod. Chapter 10. In the Emperor's Service. Rightful Rest. A sign from the throne. The dormitory was hot and close, so many tired bodies lying in ranks of bunk beds 4 high, their exhausted exhalations filling the enclosed space with levels of carbon dioxide the wheezing air purifiers struggled to deal with. It was hard for Nora Nissen to stay awake while she waited for everyone else to slumber. They were exhausted after their work. Rest periods were short. None of them were ever completely fresh. Finally, when she thought she would pass out, the last of her dormmates fell asleep, their breath evening out from work time's anxious rasp to a gentler rhythm. She waited a couple of moments to be sure, before reaching under her pillow for her idol. Her fingers closed around bone, and she pulled it out. She held it so close to her face that her breath warmed it. Looking at it before she began her prayers always helped somehow. The note left with it on her chair that first day told her the bone had come from the leg of the first person to sit in her cubicle, but she didn't believe that. Regardless, it was very old. The carving of the small figure sitting on a blocky throne had been rubbed smooth by generations of owners. It wasn't well made. The arms of the throne were lopsided, and the head of the emperor was too big, the lines of his halo crooked, but in its own way it was beautiful, delightedly silky to the touch, the lines stained a warm brown that contrasted with yellow, polished smooth by generations of hands. She gripped it in both hands and pushed it hard against her forehead. "God Emperor," she whispered, "you know all things, and you know what I wish to ask. Please guide me now in my moment of need. If only once in my life you can spare your attention for me, away from the suffering many who are unlucky not to live upon holy terror, away from the terrible wars your brave warriors fight, away from the scourging of the heretic, the mutant and the alien. I am nothing. I am beneath the notice of even my blockmates, but I have your sign, and I ask most fervently that you direct me now, so that I might better serve your holy imperium." She feared she was being blasphemous, for she was asking permission to break the emperor's laws. Was that not an affront to the emperor? Was that not the antithesis of service? But she'd been thinking about the missive for the last 3 days and couldn't get it out of her mind. A displeased moan came from the bunk opposite hers. There was only a gap of a few feet between the bed stacks, hardly enough to walk down. A woman called Shaisha slept an arm's reach from her. "Shut up, Nissen," groaned Shaisha. "You're keeping me awake." "Your snoring keeps me awake every night," snapped Nora, surprising herself. I'm praying for sleep. Shut up," Shaisha said, and rolled over. Nora waited until Shaisha's breathing slowed again before continuing, though now she whispered more quietly. "Do I act upon this or not? Do I try to get someone to listen?" She took a deep breath. "I am sorry. I am not worthy. Guide me now, please. Tell me what you want me to do." Nora screwed up her eyes, waiting for divine inspiration to strike her. She didn't know what to expect. She felt ashamed to be asking the emperor directly like this. The tarot had been good to her. Shriver Leonard told them that the emperor was concerned with so many things. He could not watch everyone, though he assured them he loved them all, as he loved all pure, proper members of the human race. She clutched the little effigy so tightly her fingers went numb, and screwed up her eyes until stars burst across her vision. Nothing happened. Abashed, she fell asleep. She awoke a couple of hours later, according to the glowing segment clock on the wall. A centile division winked out as the end of the day's first millennial neared. She wiped drool from her mouth and rolled over, but there was a brighter light in her eyes than the clock's, and she rubbed at them until she could see. The dormitory was never dark. Blue lumens cast a twilight gloom over the place, and there was the clock's eerie green face. But now a blade of hard light poked at her. She raised her hand against it, and saw that the door to the dormitory was ajar. That never happened. They were locked in at lights out, and only let out before work shift to break their fast and perform morning prayers. But the rooms were checked 3 times a night by the scribum watchers. Perhaps one of them had left the door open. Or maybe, her heart hammered in her chest, bringing her instantly awake. Maybe it was a sign. The missive was under her bedsheet. She hadn't a clue what she would do with it or why she had brought it back. If she was caught with it outside her cubicle, she would suffer. "The Emperor works through his people," Shriver Leonard told her lovingly while he laid the stick across her back.
He is the arbiter of all. I am his instrument. This gives me no pleasure. That was a vile lie. But now, if she went, she would never be able to return. They might kill her. Her only hope was to get the missive to a higher level, get far enough away to claim her rights as a scribum errant, guided by his divine will. They would try to stop her getting out, but success would be proof enough that her cause was true. The light in the corridor beckoned, so bright, so enticing. She grabbed the sheet and took her sack of clothes from its peg. "For the Emperor," she whispered to herself. Her feet made no noise on the floor as she padded out, and nobody woke up to see her go. Nora left the dormitory and fled into little used, unlit ways. Her free time was practically non-existent, but for a while, what little she had spent wandering, sometimes into places she should not go. Too many of her expeditions had ended with the application of the Shriver's stick, and she had stopped months ago, but not before she had a good knowledge of the ways around the cubicularium. Her world was circumscribed, but she knew more of it than most, enough to head confidently away to the edge of her scribe clan's territory. There was only one person Nora could think of that might be able to help her, and even he might turn her in. Anyone would turn her in. She had to get out of her section before she could claim her scribum errant's rights. What she was doing was unthinkable for most of her peers. She had little idea why she was doing it herself. An urge rose up in her heart and pushed her on. She was following some other Nora to her destruction, but she couldn't stop herself, and she didn't want to. Away from the cubicularium, the scribe clan's spire was empty. Dark doorways yawned, the halls behind abandoned. Drafts whistling over unseen obstructions suggested huge spaces, but no life was in them. Everything was covered in a patina of grime. Few lumens were working that she remembered. It surprised her that they had not been replaced. She supposed that the Imperium was an eternal thing, dirt and all, but the failure of the lights in her lifetime made her think. If something had changed for the worse recently, maybe it was part of a longer decline. Maybe this had all been clean once. Everything she owned had been someone else's. Everywhere she went had hosted hundreds of generations before her own. Newness was an alien concept, but her mind stirred. What if, she wondered, the halls of her clan had once been full of light, and all the machines had worked all of the time? It was impossible to imagine. She walked corridors whose floors were thick with dust and whose air was stale. Surely they had always been that way the Emperor had made them. In no time at all, she reached the limit of her earlier explorations. A corridor with an odd kink in it marked the furthest she had ever dared go from her workplace. The wall plating was buckled there, pushed in by machines, shifted from their mountings by a hivequake. The edges of the tear, though ragged, were as dirty as the rest of the wall, black and sticky with thousands of years of accreted filth. She'd never dared go past that rupture before. She halted in front of it, her small hands clenching and unclenching. She touched the missive tucked into her belt. Taking a deep breath, she left her life behind. Nora was forced to rejoin the main thoroughfare, linking her people's territory to the next. She had followed this road only once before, going the other way, when she had been bartered from her parents' clan into the Departamento Processium Quinta. That day had been momentous, and she had never forgotten it. There was a bridge between the Processium Quinta spire and the Tower of Archivists, carried on a high arch over a chasm hundreds of feet deep. There were crowds of people using the way, many of them low-caste scribums like herself, so she did not stand out. She kept her head down and walked as quickly as she dared, without drawing attention to herself. A hot wind rose from beneath the bridge, making the robes of the travellers flap. Though the deeps were hidden to view, above her she could see a sky of metal plates and clusters of pipes. Dishevelled birds flew between high eyries. Both buildings looked the same. She did not know the difference between a tower and a spire. There didn't seem to be one. They were metal cliffs facing each other across a chasm. Being in such an open space made her dizzy, and she was glad to cross. On the far side, she joined crowds of people. They were noisy, chattering freely. The archivists of the tower were renowned for their ill tempers. She'd been on the receiving end of their invective often enough when making a request, and she was not surprised to find every conversation heated. But then the flow of people got slower, and the crowds thicker. Grumbling escalated to shouting, shouting into violence. She found herself shoved in every direction, crushed between jostling shoulders, until the crowd bounced her through itself, and she emerged at the front. She collided with a man in such dazzling robes that she almost screamed. He was carrying something long in his hands, and it took her a moment to recognize it as a gun. Another thing she had never seen, only read of in the endless missives she categorized. She was pushed back by an archivist wearing the black sash of the Literati enforcers and caught by the crowd's many arms. The road was blocked by a barricade of linked rockcrete sections. There was a single gap in the middle through which people were passing, one at a time. The man in the dazzling clothes was a soldier, she saw, one of two at the barrier. One stood at the gap, his gun ready, guarding a mid-level acolyte as he checked documents. The second, the one she'd bounced off, was walking up and down, keeping a thin corridor of clear space between the Literati enforcers and the crowd. There was a lot of shouting. The weight of people behind was shoving the crowd forward, fractions of an inch at a time. She could not go back, and without permit papers, she could not go forward. She turned round, her body rolling over the solid wall of people behind her, looking for another way. An archivist and an enforcer were having a lively row right by her ear, dazing her. There was a tall arch a few yards back, through which another stream of people passed. She turned sideways, her skinny body finally allowing her to slip back through the press to the passageway. She looked back, unsure whether to take this other route, and saw the soldier raise his gun and fire a flash of blue light, which made a crack like a failing lumen bulb.
"Back! Back!"
he shouted. The crowd heaved. The complaints increased. An ugly atmosphere took hold. Nora pushed her way onto the narrower road. She really had no idea where she was going. Behind her, there was more gunfire, and people screamed. Chapter 11. A Hopeless Situation. Crusade of Slaughter. Inquisitor Rostov. The heavens of Fomor 3 burned with unnatural fire. A poisonous slash cut across sky and sun alike, weeping purples, blues, oranges, pinks, and colours that had no human name. The wound defied reality, being dark at the height of day, and the filth it poured ran down the sky like paint dribbled on glass, robbing the heavens of their true dimensions and making them seem flat and unreal. Against this tortured backdrop, a mighty void battle raged. The Crusade of Slaughter had ravaged the entire Makorta sector, pushing the Imperium back south of the Korevrekan, and now the Empire's armies were ceding ground. The broken remnants of Imperial forces were gathered at Fomor 3 for evacuation. Scenting victory, the Lords of Chaos committed more troops from elsewhere in the conflict zone, and the Loyalist fleets concentrated there were coming under heavy attack from a growing heretic presence. Capital ships maneuvered in low orbit, raking each other with salvos of energy cannon. Failing void shields ripped at the upper atmosphere, adding uncanny booms to the tumult of weapons fire. The war carried on in layers up into the sky that seemed to pass into infinity, stack after stack of ships eviscerating each other above the world. Shells and rockets fired by both sides from orbit powered down on the tips of white contrails, bombarding positions on the ground. Chunks of debris were more indiscriminate in their destruction. Blasted from the flanks of warships, they fell in fiery rain all over the dying planet, devastating whatever they hit. Columns of laser light flicked up from the few remaining defense silos, bracketing the horizons in a brilliant cage. Attack craft screamed overhead, trying their best to keep the orbital extraction corridors free of the enemy. Explosions flashed around darting shapes as they dueled with enemy fighters and wailing bestial engines. Into the middle of this storm, the evacuation craft flew. Ships of all kinds had been pressed into service to effect the getaway. Fat landers, shuttlecraft, dedicated troop transports, gunships, minor lighters, diplomatic barks, and supply conveyors lumbered up and down, carrying the Imperial forces away. Planetary to orbital flight was slow and laborious, and the ships passed from one maelstrom to another, whichever way they were going, for the fight on the ground was as fierce as it was in the sky. The difficulties of scaling and descending the gravity well made each vessel vulnerable on approach and departure, and with every trip a handful was speared by lasbeam or missile and crashed down onto those they would save. Time was running out for Lieutenant Lacranti and his men. Imperial rearguard actions held the enemy back from the evacuation site, desperate battles fought by doomed men, their lives callously spent so that others might get off-world to fight again. The full ground forces of the enemy were yet to commit themselves to attacking the extraction zone, too busy mopping up stragglers and annihilating isolated army groups. When they did, the evacuation would be over. The certainty of that hung like an anvil around Lacrante's neck. His platoon still had far to go. They hugged the ridge of a long, low hill, hoping they would not be seen as they raced for salvation. The hillside had been churned into chaotic hillocks by persistent bombardment. A few days before, the landscape had been one of open fields sweeping down to the bottom of a shallow valley, rolling plains whose gentle patterns repeated for hundreds of miles of well-ordered agricole, tended by servitor machines. Of that, only a broken mudscape remained. Their boots broke vitrified soil crust and splashed in mingled puddles of blood and water as they skulked along a trough carved by a starship lance. At the bottom of the scar, they were unseen and unnoticed, hidden in a crack in the world. Lecrante was beginning to think they might make it, at least as far as the zone. Getting onto a ship would be another matter. They were late, but one thing at a time, as his old pa used to say.
We've 5 more miles, that's all,
Lecrante said, for his own benefit as much as his men's.
5 more miles and we live.
He tried to ignore the storm of fire around the landers. Get to the zone, get on a ship, get up into the air. So many barriers to continued life. Once in the void, they would have to pray that their ship would not be destroyed, then that they would make it into the warp, and on and on. Death waited for them at every stage, however far they got. Lecrante focused on the next second, one foot in front of another, through the mud and noise. A man will endure all manner of pain and terror for a few more breaths. They kept low, cursing quietly when their boots slipped out from under them. The period of grace did not last. They never did, not in war. There was never any more than a few seconds of peace. Lecrante heard the chanting before his men did, and held up a hand. The 24 troopers left in his command came to a weary halt.
Listen,
he hissed.
Corn! 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 Corn!
A chant so harsh it was almost mechanical, carried on the wind like distant waves.
Corn! Corn! Corn!
The snap-crackle of weapons fire followed, then the screams of the dying. Lecrante looked back into 11 filthy faces. His men were drawn from half a dozen worlds, and were all of different kinds, but he could not tell who was who under the mud coating them. They had the same fear in their eyes, and the same trust that he would save them. The screaming came from the south, just over the ridge. The evacuation zone was to the east. He could leave it. He hesitated. Despite the guns and the maniacal chanting of the heretics, it seemed to have become very quiet. He couldn't leave it. He never could. He had to see. He might be able to help.
You, Pelson, with me,
he said, picking a soldier who shared his sense of duty.
The rest of you, wait here.
Lecrante and Pelson clambered on their elbows and knees up the slope of mud. Soft and blocky chunks alternately caught their limbs, then disintegrated under their bellies, making them slip back. The stink of rotting meat rose from the ground. Most of the planet's people were dead. Being churned into the earth of their home was the best burial, and the cleanest death any of them could hope for. When they reached the top of the ridge, the chanting hit them with renewed volume.
Corn! Corn! Corn!
Corn was the name Lecrante had not heard 6 months ago. He had arrived at Fomor 3 ahead of the attack, when the world was pure and clean and free of war. The things he'd seen since then. Strength leaked out of him, his eyes unfocused. His mind drifted into relived atrocity. He shook himself out of it. Now was not the time. About half a mile away, at the bottom of the ruptured slope, a column of civilians were moving along the remains of the main Heath to Drendon highway, towns that were now heaps of smoking rubble. They must have heard about the military evacuation and were making a last effort to stay alive, just like him. The enemy had found the refugees. It didn't matter to the heretics who they killed, soldier or civilian. All blood was the same to them.
Corn! Corn! Corn!
The slaughter cult chanted as they slew. There was nothing Lecrante could do. Too many, too far away. They'd be cut down in minutes.
Emperor damn them all!
Lecrante turned onto his back and slid away from the top of the ridge. He couldn't see the horrible colours of the wounded sky from there, only blue. Contrails weaved smoky patterns. A pair of cruisers were exchanging fire above them, pale shapes in the day, far, far above. It looked almost peaceful, a war of clouds.
Sir,
said Pelson. He had not stopped looking. Lecrante turned his head and patted the man's shoulder.
We can't do anything. 6 of those debased space marines are with the turncoats. They'll kill us all.
Pelson shook his head. His eyes were hollow.
I'm sick of this. I can't bear it. We have to help them. We'll die, said Lecrante. Even if we save them, they won't take them on the ships. This is a military withdrawal, not a civilian evacuation. They'll be turned away. At least this way they will die quickly. Corn! 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 Corn!
The snap of lasguns was joined by the brutal, stomach-churning bark of bolt guns and the snarl of chain weapons. The screaming was getting closer. The enemy were driving some of them up the slope towards Lacrante's position.
Sir, we can't, said Lacrante.
He tried to be gentle with Pelson. The man didn't listen, but slowly got to his feet.
I've had enough, Pelson said through gritted teeth. They're being slaughtered. What good are we, the shield of the Imperium, if we hide on our bellies in the mud? Thrones light! Get down! Pelson, they'll see you!
Lacrante rolled over onto his front, grabbed Pelson's ankle and tugged. Pelson fell down. Lacrante was too late. A group of civilians had got away from the main group and were pointing up at Lacrante's position. Sensing salvation, they broke into a desperate run over the churned earth. If only they had not seen. Perhaps the platoon would have got away. But the refugees drew the attention of a massive figure in baroque brass armor caked in blood. His helm rose up in two broad flat horns. Hair plumes swung under them as his head turned in Lacrante's direction. Lacrante pushed himself back down the slope, but the warrior looked right at him, and he knew he had been spotted.
You've killed us all,
he spat at Pelson.
We're dead already,
Pelson said, and slowly got back to his feet. Lacrante slipped back down the earth bank.
Run,
he shouted to his men.
Run, all of you!
They looked up in fright. Pelson was taking aim with his gun, but slowly, moving dreamily.
Get out of here!
Lacrante shouted, slapping them into action. They skidded about in the mud of the broken land as they fled. Pelson stood alone on the brink of the ridge, gun stock pressed into his shoulder. Lacrante was looking right at him when a mass reactive round took him in the stomach and blew him apart.
Move! Move!
He screamed. A cold part of him calculated how near the heretic Astartes must be to have hit Pelson with a single pistol shot like that. They weren't going to make it. The lance track had been eroded by the violent storms that had been sweeping the planet since the war began, and a gully opened up to their left, leading up to the top of the hill. Thin, slippery mud gathered there, and they struggled up the steepening slope. Against all reason, Lacrante hoped that if they made the top, they could get away down the other face of the hill. The growl of power armor approaching behind them suggested otherwise. Lacrante knew what was coming for them and did not look back. One of his men did, and screamed at what he saw. A terrifying vox-amplified battle cry smote their ears.
Blood! For the blood god!
One of Lacrante's men exploded. Shrapnel from the bolt round and fragments of bone stung Lacrante's cheek, spurring him on like a whip. Servos growled. The Space Marine's reactor pack hummed with the demands of hard use. A gauntlet stained rusty red plucked one of the men at Lacrante's side, screaming into the air. The others were shouting, jostling in the narrow space of the rising gully. He stopped. There was no way he was going to get out. Pelson was right. A sudden rage roared through Lacrante's body. He drew his las pistol. He felt ashamed.
Stand, men! Stand! Do you want to die like men or like cowards?
Slowly, deliberately, he turned to face his death. The Space Marine was a monster, 8 feet tall, clad in armor decorated with screaming faces. He held Lacrante's struggling man over his head in both hands. The Space Marine's weapons swung, ignored, from the chains binding them to his wrists. He was straining, pulling hard. The trooper shrieked in agony. There was a tearing noise, the cracking of bone, and in a sudden rush of gore, he came in too, dousing the Space Marine in blood and entrails. The heretic Astartes roared and tossed aside the halves of his victim.
Skulls for the Skull Throne!
Lacrante took aim. His hands shook from adrenaline and terror, but he was so close he could not miss, and the beams hit true, vaporizing chunks of ceramite. They did not penetrate the armor. A Space Marine kill shot with a las pistol was 100,000 to 1 chance, but he kept on firing. The warrior spread his arms, leaned into the blasts, and roared.
Fight, men! Fight! For the Emperor! You are going to die! Die well!
Lacrante shouted. 2 las beams snapped over his head in response, both connecting near the Space Marine's neck. His men were aiming for the more vulnerable seal there, away from the layers of plasteel and ceramite that protected the damned warrior. It was the only chance they had to fell him. One shot slagged part of the Space Marine's vox grill.
Another scored a black mark across his pauldrons, and yet the warrior stood, head erect, fist clenched, basking in the bursts of concentrated light. Lecrante and his 2 men walked backwards, still firing. The rest of the platoon had scrabbled up out of the gully and were fleeing down the other side of the hill. Lecrante's weapon clicked dry, followed quickly after by those of his men. The warrior's armour was covered in lasburn scoring. One of his hair plumes was smouldering. He let his arms drop.
For the glory of honor in combat, I have given you your chance to best me, for I recognize your inferiority.
Though his voice was a thick growl, he spoke calmly, at odds with his berserk manner.
You failed. Now you will die, and your blood shall water the plains of skulls at Khorne's feet. Rejoice, for you go to a better master than the Emperor ever was.
They opened fire again. This time, the Space Marine responded, swinging the bolt pistol by its chain, using it as a flail, and smashing the skull of one of the 2 soldiers to fragments. Another swing brought his chain axe back into his grasp. The warrior squeezed its activation trigger, and the chain blade spun. The second soldier shouted an incoherent battle cry and lunged at the Space Marine with his bayonet extended. The warrior laughed. The blade skidded off the breastplate, and the Space Marine smashed down with the butt of his axe, caving in the back of the soldier's ribcage and laying his spine bare. The warrior pointed at Lecrante.
Your turn. Fight well. Khorne is watching.
If Lecrante still had his power sword, there was the smallest chance he might have prevailed, but even had he not lost it, the Space Marine would probably have beaten him. He was being toyed with. There was no doubt he was going to die.
Fight me, said the warrior, for the glory of Khorne.
Lecrante's hands shook so hard he could barely take another power pack from his belt. It took him 3 tries to eject the spent pack and slot the fresh home. The warrior laughed, low and hard, but joyfully. He raised his chain axe in salute before his face. Lecrante aimed. The Space Marine moved so fast, Lecrante didn't have time to squeeze the trigger. The axe came screaming for his head, but never connected. A plasma stream roared over his shoulder, catching the Space Marine full in the chest. Superheated gas vaporized his breastplate, scalding Lecrante's face. The resulting explosion threw the heretic sideways, where he lay stunned for half a second. He grunted and rose from the dirt. The edges of his melted plate glowed red, and smoke rose from the cooked flesh beneath. He growled and reached out. 2 shots rang out in quick order. Bright flashes of light punched holes directly over each of the Space Marine's hearts. He looked down at the mess his torso had become, fell to his knees, and toppled sideways into the mud. Lecrante turned round to his saviors, and was appalled to see a squat, barrel-shaped creature with a flat head. It had large, moist eyes widely set in a vaguely fish-like face, and wore a brown cloak over armor of scratched black metal. In its hands, it carried a slender rifle with a square profile. Lecrante immediately raised his gun and fired. The last bolt struck the being in the shoulder, burning a hole in its cloak.
"Son of a..."
the creature said, with a voice like broken rocks.
"I saved your life, you ingrate!"
From beneath its cloak, a second pair of arms emerged, each holding a pistol of wildly different design. A man Lecrante hadn't noticed before stood from a kneeling position and put a restraining hand on the creature's arm.
"Leave him be,"
he said. He wore a patched Astra Militarum uniform of a regiment Lecrante didn't know, and carried a sun gun, a deadly plasma weapon usually issued to specialist squads. It was a heavy weapon for a mortal man, and dangerous to its operators too, but he held it casually while it spewed white gas from its cooling vents.
"Don't shoot the one that saved you," he shouted down to Lecrante. "Don't they teach you anything in the Guard these days?"
He came down the short slope and roughly checked over Lecrante, grabbing at his labels, rank badges, and equipment.
"Lieutenant, eh? This is your lucky day. Better give me that," he said, pulling Lecrante's las pistol from his hand. "My name's Antoniato, by the way. Nice to meet you."
He winked.
"My lord,"
he said into a vox pip on the collar of his dirty uniform.
"I've got one alive here. Shall we take him with us?"
At first, Lecrante thought the man was addressing the creature. He stared at it in open puzzlement.
"What are you looking at?"
The thing's mottled brown face wrinkled in annoyance.
"Damn Terran ape,"
it said.
"You can put your guns away, Chilka.
said the soldier. Chilka spun its pistols around and stuffed them into holsters under its robe.
Idiot burned a hole in my cloak. This is my favorite cloak.
It's your only cloak, said Antoniato.
It almost hit the box.
It said, jabbing a thumb at the blocky pack it carried.
Thing's millions of years old and practically invulnerable. A last bolt won't do it any harm.
A beep sounded from his earpiece. Antoniato nodded.
On our way. That is your lord,
said Lacrante, nodding at the creature.
No,
said Antoniato. He took Lacrante's arm and pulled him up the slope. The sun gun was still radiating heat and drew sweat from Lacrante's face. They came level with Chilka, who scowled at him.
I'm sorry, said Lacrante. I didn't mean to shoot your mutant.
Gods of pity,
Chilka said, shaking its head. It stomped off.
Chilka isn't a mutant.
Xenos, said Antoniato with a chuckle.
Chicanti.
Lacrante stared.
Never seen one, eh?
said Antoniato.
But they're evil,
said Lacrante, feebly.
Screw you! Evil yourself,
said Chilka over its shoulder.
The galaxy's a lot more complicated than you think,
said Antoniato.
Know that Chilka is on our side. One of the best.
I shot him. Chilka threw up its hands and moaned. Lacrante looked at Antoniato.
You're doing very well at this,
said Antoniato. Chilka is female. I wouldn't say anything else about her until you found your mind again, or she might shoot you. He squeezed Lacrante's bicep. It's not your fault. You faced a heretic space marine. You're lucky to be alive. It's not good for the soul, fighting something like that. He looked back at the smoking corpse. Gather your thoughts. He slapped Lacrante's shoulder. They crested the hill. The last few men of Lacrante's platoon had scattered, and he could see only one of them staggering down the churned-up slope, too far to call to, and heading in the wrong direction.
This is our lord, said Antoniato.
There was a man of around 30 years of age waiting for them, clad in close-fitting carapace armour. It looked like it was ordinarily highly polished silver, but now it was covered in mud, like everything else on the plain. He wore a large rosary around his neck, and the small figure at the centre of the wooden beads was bright gold, as if freshly polished. He was young for someone who exuded such authority. His skin had a faint reddish cast to it Lacrante would have found odd if he hadn't just met Chilka. His blonde hair was shaved around the sides of his head, with a close-cropped thicket left atop. A couple of augmetic lines ran up from the back of his neck, entering the skull above his left ear through a silver plug. There was a large imperial eye tattooed on the skin beneath them, on the shaved portion of his scalp.
Lord Inquisitor,
said Antoniato.
There's an ambush ongoing down on the highway. There are more enemy troops coming in. We're not going to be able to get out that way. You, Lieutenant, have you fought here for long?
The man asked.
You're an Inquisitor, said Lacrante.
I am Rostov, he said blandly, of the Ordo Xenos. Lacrante stared dumbly. Do you know what that is? Said Rostov.
Everybody knows about the Inquisition, said Lacrante. Everybody knows the stories about the Inquisition, corrected Antoniato, which are mostly Groxdung. Answer his question. I've been here since before the invasion, said Lacrante. 6 months. I was part of the garrison here. First in, last to leave.
Our ship is hidden 2 miles east of this point, said the Inquisitor. His eyes were penetrating. Lacrante recognized the look. The man was a witch.
Is there any way of getting there undetected?
Rostov pressed buttons set in his gauntlet. A cartolith of the plane opened in the air over his wrist, and he held it out to Lacrante. Lacrante approached and studied the map. The troop displacements on the display were hours out of date. He shook his head.
The enemy are closing in from all sides. You're too late. My regiment...
Which regiment? Rostov asked.
The 47th Ilositi Pioneers, said Lacrante.
Go on, said the Inquisitor.
We were moving through that quadrant as we fell back to the evacuation zone this morning, when we were attacked and scattered. It's been in enemy hands since then. A lot of armour moving through and thousands of turncoats. The Valkyrie's signum transponder is still emitting, said Antoniato. They will have found it. That the machine spirit still calls is a trap, said Rostov.
He looked towards the chaos around the evacuation zone.
There is only one way off-world now. We must be quick.
The Navy will not hold position for much longer. Their position is becoming untenable. My men, said Lecrante. He couldn't believe they'd vanished after all they had been through. They're gone, said Rostov, and started to walk. Chilka fell in with him, not bothered by the pack she carried, though it seemed heavy. Antoniato grasped Lecrante's shoulder. Looks like you're out of friends. You best come with us, he said. Chapter 12. Unbreakable Seal. Bound by War. Noble Sacrifice. The enemy were closing in on the zone by the time Rostov's party reached the cordon. Artillery fire rumbled in the distance, not yet close enough to directly shell the zone, but methodically obliterating the last columns fighting their way there. The air war was raging intensely only a few hundred feet above the plain, where swift lightning fighters dueled with shrieking machines. Only in the void did the battle seem to be going the Imperium's way. The enemy could not yet get good firing angles from orbit, and the ship seemed more occupied with the Imperial Navy than the ground. Yet occasional super-atmospheric fire nibbled at the edges of the zone, and it was creeping closer. There were thousands of men and women in uniform waiting to pass the checkpoint through the defense line. A few civilians were mixed in with the troops, and in general there appeared to be a lack of organization. The dun uniforms of Lecrante's regiment mixed randomly with the brighter jackets of the Plovian bombardiers and the green-piped greatcoats of the light Adriatic 5th. There were too many of them trying to get through the cordon, spilling off the road and onto the muddy ground either side. The troops manning the line watched them warily. Through a hellish racket of bombs and flashing energy weapons, booming reports and the crackle of tortured air, Rostov pushed grimly on, following a road buckled under the weight of armoured vehicles. Lecrante fully expected to be left behind, but Antoniato herded him forward. He was no milk-livered recruit. Lecrante had distinguished himself in combat several times, but there was only so much a man could take. Days without sleep, the looming promise of defeat, the strange turn of events that had swept him up took their toll, and he was reduced to a stumbling shadow of himself. A stray fusion beam slammed into the earth not 500 feet away, slaying 50 men and sending a scalding blast of vaporized flesh and soil that cooked 100 more where they stood. A cacophony of screams overcame the roar of the battle, sending quivers of panic through the mass. Soldiers jammed shoulder to shoulder staggered as they were shoved. Lecrante succumbed to the herd's fear, stumbled off the raised embankment of road into the muddy field at the side. He lost sight of Rostov until Antoniato pushed weary men aside with the bulk of his plasma gun, came down, grabbed Lecrante's bicep, and hauled him back up onto the crumpling rockcrete. Keep going, he said quietly. If the enemy come now, this is going to be a massacre. We need to get off this planet fast, because the enemy are not stupid. They can see we're pushed into the dueling cage bars. They just need to finish us. It'll happen soon, and when it does, it will happen quickly. A flight of fighters screeched overhead. A combination of fire from the void ships and aeronautica craft kept the perimeter whole, but it was shrinking inwards with every moment. When the ships get through, they'll murder everyone, said Antoniato quietly. Ground troops won't be far behind. You've seen an evacuation like this before, said Lecrante. Antoniato shrugged. His troubled face told Lecrante everything he needed to know. Rostov said nothing as he pushed through the crowds, waiting to be evacuated. Chilka at his side. The alien drew hostile looks from every man and woman present there. People recoiled from her and fingered their rifles nervously, but none of them moved against the small party, for Inquisitor Rostov's presence safeguarded them all. The Inquisitor wore his insignia openly. This dissuaded attack, yet Lecrante thought his presence alone would have kept them safe. His bearing was different to every other human being on the field. He was surrounded by an aura of authority that no one would dare to challenge. It could have been psychic in nature, Lecrante thought. Whatever it was, you could tell he was a man of great power. Men turned round with snarls on their faces when they felt his hand in the small of their backs. The threat of violence was thicker than the smoke billowing off the burning plains, but all impulse to action died when they saw who wanted them to make way. Desperate men became meek at the sign of the inquisitorial skull and eye embossed on Rostov's breastplate. None could meet his eye. Some bowed, some turned away pale-faced. Nearly all made the Aquila and mouthed a snatch of prayer. A few of the braver ones shouted out for blessing from this holy servant of the Emperor, only for the words to die on their lips when Rostov looked at them, and so the party went by unmolested, all the while the guns fired, the skies thundered, and the enemy came closer to victory.
A steel pole held at waist height on metal crosses blocked the road where it went through the perimeter. 2 Astra Militarum peacekeepers guarded it, processing every person as they came forward, although the real disincentive to pushing through was the unit of Militarum Tempestus Scions stood a little way back in a double firing line. Rostov walked straight to the barrier. He held up a small ivory seal into which was carved the mark of his order. A ruby was set into the forehead of the skull, and this flashed, painting a light image of the seal a foot high in the air above him. "You will let me through," Rostov said, "and convey me with all due haste to your commanding officer." The peacekeeper manning the barrier nodded dumbly. He lifted the pole and stepped aside. His comrade watched, holding a soldier's papers, forgotten, in his hand.
What are you looking at, you stupid bastards?
Chilka said. "Harsh," said Rostov. The peacekeeper took them through the defense line and onto a path of wobbling duckboards sinking into the mire, which led to a tarpaulin raised over a battered table. A large long-range Vox set sat in the center. Maps spilled off around the edges. A hunched Vox operator occupied the only chair, speaking rapidly into a covered Vox horn. 2 captains stood at his shoulders, peering at the maps and giving words to be passed on, listening, then asking brief questions. One was a tall woman, the other a shorter man, both grey with fatigue and worry. Rostov approached without comment, reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed message cylinder. The man looked up. His eyebrow rose a little, but he was either too surprised or too collected to say anything. "You will datacast these files on this cylinder to the 3 ships Orledon, Duke Bove, and Incandescence," he said. "To them only, for their shipmasters. Give these signifiers." He passed a scrap of parchment over. "Destroy both when you are done. You will convey me and my men immediately to a place of extraction." The woman looked at the man. Obedience was bred into him. There was no way he was going to refuse to aid them, but he was curious. "Why are you here?" Antoniato stood forward. "You know better than to ask," he began, but Rostov cut him off. "I have information of extreme importance to the success of the Emperor's armies in this subsector. If you aid me in getting it off this world, you will earn his immortal gratitude." "Of course." The Vox crackled, incomprehensible messages delivered with urgency. The operator murmured into his Vox horn. "Turn that off. Switch to datacast," Rostov demanded. The operator was so invested in his work, he objected. "But sir, I have the general to—" "Now," he said. "It doesn't matter what the general has to say. It's over." The Vox operator took the cylinder, unscrewed the cap, pulled out a rubber plug, and set the cylinder into the input jack it protected. "Priority message," he murmured into his Vox horn. "Prepare for data X-load." The officer found a fresh resolve. He stood taller. He seemed almost heroic. "I will take you. Follow me. Adrana, it is time," he said to his comrade. "I will return soon." Adrana nodded. They clasped hands. Both were emotional. They were close, Lacrante thought. Too close for regulations, probably. But there seemed also to be an air of relief to their interaction, a sense of an arduous duty nearly finished. Their lives would be over soon, and they were glad. "This way," said the male officer. Adrana straightened her uniform, and the 2 officers led Rostov's group out of the tent and round a stack of munitions crates. There was a Salamander command vehicle round the back of them. The officer got into the driver's compartment. Rostov, Chilka, and Antoniata climbed into the open-top crew deck at the back. Lacrante waited for Rostov's order to get aboard, expecting that he would be left behind to fight with his countrymen. Rostov paid him no attention, but Antoniato gestured him forward and reached out his hand. Lacrante took it, and Antoniato pulled him aboard. Adrana clambered with weary care up the pile of crates. Once atop it, she stood tall, framed by the burning death trails of downed aircraft and the violent interplay of warship combat. "Warriors of the Imperium!" Adrana shouted. She had a clear, strong voice that cut through the rumble of the war. She must have been a good singer, thought Lacrante. He was already thinking of her in the past tense. "Warriors of the Imperium!" At the second call, soldiers looked up to her. They stared from their posts on the defense line, from the doors of bunkers, from makeshift beds in the mud, from guttering campfires. They watched her over recaf mugs and low sticks, over steaming ration tins. "We have made our stand here on Fomor 3, so that others might carry on the great war for survival being waged in every part of the galaxy," she shouted. Her voice carried cleanly over the noise of battle. "We have fought for the Makota Sound. We have fought for the Imperium. We have fought for our Emperor." She paused. "Our fight ends today." Only a few hours before, Lacrante had delivered a similar speech to his own men, albeit far less eloquently. He wanted to stand up and call to Adrana, to tell her that she might live, that the strangest things could happen. But he knew for her that was not true. For some reason, the Emperor had taken him this far, but he had not chosen her. She was already dead. "I've asked so much of you in these last months," Adrana said. "You have given me everything. You have given him everything. Now, for the final time, I ask only that you do your duty once more," said Adrana, her voice rising with passion. "That you—" The male captain ignited the salamander's engine, drowning out his comrade's words. The tracks spun in the mud, sending out wet plumes behind the vehicle. It slid from side to side, then the tracks bit, and it lurched forward, picking up speed, until it was racing towards the center of the evacuation zone and salvation. The guns started hitting the zone before they were halfway to their destination. A high whistling preceded each falling shell. They shrieked like they were laughing, their detonations punchlines to cruel jokes. Sirens wailed all over the evacuation zone. The salamander raced past groups of exhausted men waiting to be taken to safety. They were stirring, standing up slowly as the first explosions boomed over the camp. Then they were running. Whistles blew, men shouted. Lacrante looked skywards. The tempo of the void battle had changed. The Imperial ships were breaking off, so slowly he was not sure at first, but their engine stacks glowed with plasma burn. They turned and moved faster, their washed-out daytime shapes lifting higher into the void. The captain drove well. Men scattered before him, but he hit none. A dragon-headed attack craft swooped down from the sky, vomiting fire from its mechanical maw like the beast of legend. It wrote a long signature of destruction across the zone in flame, catching a store of promethium barrels that blew like pyrotechnic novelties on Sanguinala, lifting high on short-lived rocket trails of fuel. Soldiers screamed as they were immolated. The roaring dragon thing turned, opened up its mouth again, but before it could fire, it was chased away by a pair of interdiction fighters, and all three raced off out of view. The captain sped through the burning and the screaming. Lacrante watched, horrified, holding on for dear life. None of his companions seemed concerned. Rostov watched the sky, reading the battle with an expertise Lacrante could not match. Antoniato stood at the front, holding on hard but staring ahead, as if he were driving the vehicle himself. Chilka crouched at the bottom of the open crew compartment and muttered to herself, her arms wrapped about her blocky pack. They entered the landing areas. They raced past a chugging flak gun whose conversation with the sky made Lacrante's ears ring. Large ships were lifting off, buffeting the ground with volcano winds. Another ship lit its engines. Lines of soldiers waiting to embark disintegrated into mobs, shouting for rescue. Fences collapsed under the weight of those left behind. They pushed them over, trampling comrades caught in the razor wire, spilling onto the landing aprons. A crowd was incinerated by igniting engines. Lacrante saw men gunned down by the turrets of a smaller ship as it reeled into the sky, the weight of the soldiers holding onto its landing claws, upsetting its ascent. On the salamander went, the passing landscape presenting little vignettes of despair before hurrying Lacrante on to the next, as if it were a guide in some grand guignol presentation, eager to shock and increasing the horror with each new sight. A commissioner dropped a man into the mud with a single lasgun shot to the head before he was rushed and disarmed and killed. Men turned on each other. Soldiers wept and prayed on their knees in the mud. A 100-yard-long supply craft was hit by a macro particle beam and became a cremation for those it carried, falling from the sky like a burning lantern and crushing thousands who, moments before, had clamored to get aboard. All the while the sirens wailed and the shells rained down, murdering with impunity. The officer drove faster. A series of prefabricated landing pads were clustered at the center of the evacuation zone. Smaller ships were taking off all the time from outside this area, where they had parked directly in the sea of mud. The largest purpose-built troopcraft had put down even further out, and the very last two of these were already flying, leaving a single broken-backed example burning on the field behind them. The prefab pads took ships of medium size, cargo lighters and personnel carriers. Several of them were wrecks. One looked to have been brought down on top of two others, and now all three were heaped together like smashed toys, putting out boiling clouds of black smoke that choked Lacrante.
They passed through it, and it parted like a curtain, and they saw their last hope, a small Arvis lighter, unarmed, boxy, already overfull. The captain drove straight over the low rockcrete barrier, hemming in the landing zone, bouncing his passengers hard. The ship's engines were already at full cycle, but had not ignited. Lecrante thought the officer must have voxed ahead. It was waiting for them. The captain locked the tracks and brought the salamander to a slewing halt.
You are almost too late,
He shouted over his shoulder.
My thanks to you,
Said Rostov.
Remember me, Inquisitor, in your prayers.
Said the captain.
I'm going to die here. It would soothe my heart and ease the passing of my soul into his light if I knew someone remembered that I did my duty and said the words aloud for me.
What is your name? Asked Rostov.
Herjolt Koliman,
Said the captain.
It will be done. I swear it, by the Emperor himself.
Koliman closed his eyes in thanks and waited until they were all off, then turned around and drove away. Lecrante looked back the way they had come and saw only fire and the flash of weapons. A commissar came down the rear ramp out of the Arvis's passenger compartment. A group of stormtroopers looked out.
You are Inquisitor Rostov of the Ordo Xenos?
The commissar shouted over the rising engines. A triple burst of shells made the ground tremble. Rostov waited for the noise to die before he answered.
I am. We have held this ship for you. We are full, but I will remain behind, so you may depart. It is my duty.
He was proud, this one, back as stiff as a flagpole. Old, too, his face lined with years of service.
The Emperor commends your sacrifice, said Rostov.
The commissar nodded curtly and stood aside.
But my men must come with me too,
Rostov added. The commissar's expression was the same hard, stony mien Lecrante had seen on the face of every commissar he had ever met. They made them that way, in plaster molds, he was certain. The commissar's eyes flicked to one side. A spear of plasma impacted the ground a few hundred yards away, evaporating earth, men, and equipment with an explosive roar. Nobody flinched.
My lord,
said the commissar,
I am willing to give up my life for the Emperor's glory by allowing you to continue your work. But these men here, they are loyal. I have commanded that many disobedient men should die, but these are among the best. Nevertheless, I must take my servants with me, said Rostov calmly. His pure blue eyes shone with uncanny power. The commissar looked at Lecrante and Antoniato. Antoniato raised his eyebrows at him, as if to say, hard luck. The commissar's gaze rested on Chilka, and his face hardened. You ask one of the Emperor's soldiers to give up his place for that?
He pointed.
She's done more for the Emperor than any one of these men, said Rostov evenly. I know. I speak with his authority alone.
Throughout, his voice remained level and his expression firm, but the sense of threat he gave off increased.
Now make room and die serving the Emperor, or deny me and die opposing him.
Aircraft screamed. The sirens wailed. Shell bursts and energy strikes thrummed the ground like a drum. The commissar's coat stirred in the hot wind of war. Two Imperial servants locked eyes, neither used to backing down. A commissar was the scourge of many arms of the Imperial forces, but Inquisitors were the instruments of the Emperor himself. There could only be one outcome.
Very well, said the commissar, but the Xenos must give up its weapons. She will be keeping her guns, said Rostov, so she may use them in his service.
The commissar hesitated, then nodded again. He turned about smartly and marched the short distance to the Arvis like he was on parade. At its rear, he stopped by the open ramp and indicated 3 men inside.
You, out! Make way for the Lord Inquisitor's men.
The 3 men looked at one another. One pointed at himself.
Rejoice, for the Emperor has chosen you to do his bloody work,
said the commissar.
We fight in his name and for his glory on the fields of Fomor 3.
An explosion punctuated the end of his speech. The commissar had chosen the men well, for they did not complain, but gathered up their gear and left their seats. They marched down the ramp to the landing pad, their faces grim. Rostov marched to the shuttlecraft. He waited with surprising respectfulness while Chilka waddled on board. She struggled to get up into her seat. A couple of hesitant men came forward and helped her in. Rostov followed, agile despite his heavy carapace plate.
Come on,
said Antoniato. He grabbed Lecrante and pushed him at the door.
but why me?
Lecrante said.
I should stay here. These scions are worth 4 of me. How many Astra Militarum officers do you think we see who are running from a heretic space marine but turn back to face it so his men can escape?
Antoniato invited an answer with an open expression. Lecrante didn't say anything.
I'll tell you then, said Antoniato. Not very many. That makes you unusual. Get on board. Rostov has noticed you. If there's one thing that intrigues him, it's unusual men.
Antoniato boarded first. Lecrante followed. As he strapped himself in, he looked out at one of the men whose places they had taken.
I'm sorry,
he mouthed. The man stared back. He cradled his hell gun in one arm and activated it with a flick of his thumb. Their eyes remained locked as the Arbus's engines ignited. The shuttle rose up on blades of screaming plasma. The landing zone dropped away, taking the commissar and the 3 doomed men off into insignificance until they were the size of insects. Then not even that.
We're not out of the underhive yet,
said Antoniato. He pointed across the camp, laid out like a model below them. Crowds rolled in tides around the last few ships taking off. At the edges of the evacuation zone, they were turning outwards. The enemy was coming from the north, preceded by a howling tempest. The sky was red in that direction, the hue mingling with the wound in the void, becoming one unholy storm front. Crimson lightning danced across the ground, as if the world itself were in pain, and the wind that blew smelled of blood. A horizontal cascade of las beams flashed out from the defense line. The shuttle was banking around, bouncing through air agitated by the worsening bombardment. Shells crashed down, interspersed with violent energy beams of garish colors, each surrounded by nimbuses of excited particles. Only the Empress Providence ensured that they were not hit and obliterated. Trapped in the circuit of the evacuation zone, unable to fly directly upwards for fear of becoming an easy target, the pilot corkscrewed up, and in doing so, brought them closer to the attack on the defense line. Lecrante looked down upon a scene of terrible slaughter. Outside the walls, twisted mutants ran amok, ripping men apart with glistening claws and biting them in two. They disrupted the Astra Militarum firing lines before the traitor soldiery came forth with their guns blazing at erstwhile brothers in arms. This betrayal was terrible to behold, and held Lecrante's horrified attention until his eyes found the heretic Astartes, where he witnessed worse. No more than a dozen in number, the fallen space marines tore through the Emperor's soldiers like a knife ripping through paper. They were giants in brass and blood, their armor bedecked with skulls. Though rendered tiny by distance, they were obvious among the mortal men and women below, and wherever they went, they carved bloody lanes of death through the crowds. Faced with such violence, many soldiers fled in panic, only to be cut down by whirling blades as they turned their backs. The heretic Astartes reached the wall in short order, bounding up the near-vertical ramparts in 2 or 3 strides. Once upon it, they slaughtered with renewed ferocity, clearing the firing steps of men. Las beams of blue and red stabbed at them, but none could bring them down. The shuttle turned another loop, changing the view. Lecrante saw a sentinel pilot drive his machine towards one of the space marines, its multi-laser burning the air and hitting the monster straight in his breastplate. The fallen angel of death took a wound, it seemed, but then he leapt, axe out, slamming into the walker's cockpit and bearing the light machine to the ground under his weight. The view shifted again. Lecrante caught sight of some immense centauroid machine. The upper part was a terrifying giant in brazen armor, who leaned low from a gargantuan tracked unit to cut down men a dozen times smaller than he, reaping them like a harvester and spouting bloody spray from the exhausts upon its back. Then the ship turned away from the battlefield completely and tilted, showing him only the sky and the nearing void war. The rear ramp closed, and the cabin pressurized with a hiss, shutting away the sights and sounds of violence.
"Check your fastenings,"
shouted Antoniato over the roar of the engines. Lecrante didn't really hear him. Rostov had got up and was making his way out of the cramped passenger cabin to the cockpit. Lecrante unclipped his harness and followed him, hypnotized by the violence in the sky. He had to see, and ignored Antoniato's shouts, grasping straps when the Arbus bucked or swerved around enemy attacks. Rostov opened a single door into the cockpit. The lone pilot glanced back.
"Get us up,"
commanded Rostov.
"The ships are all leaving, my lord. I'm not going to be able to catch them. We'll be brought down. We were too late."
Rostov's eyes raced over the cockpit instruments.
Ours.
That one, he said, pointing to a symbol on the screen.
We rule
Make for the St.
this
Asta.
land.
We'll never reach it, the pilot shouted. They're all moving off.
By the Emperor's grace we will, said Rostov. Give me your Vox.
The pilot gave him a questioning look, but pulled off her headset and passed it back. Lekrante eavesdropped on all this unnoticed. Then he saw a vast dagger shape plummeting down at the surface of the planet, a torpedo as large as a hive spire that punched into the ground. Its explosion turned everything white, and the shockwave lifted up the Arvis and dropped it hard. He fell sprawling into some of the seated men, smashed his head on the bar of a restraint cradle, and was knocked unconscious. Chapter 13. Escape from Fomor 3. World Death. Cannulus Obligatio. The void was bleeding. What was visible from the ground as a lurid band of colour appeared in space as a giant bloody wound. Reality had been ripped open, and the meat of creation was visible beneath. At least, that's how it appeared some of the time. If Fionnuala looked at it askance, she saw a cataract of blood falling into eternity. Other times it appeared like any warp real space interface, a mess of twisted gas and energy, bright against the dark, hardly distinguishable from the nebula. When seen like this, the vessel that led its forward edge, the knife, Fionnuala thought, was plainly detectable by the St. Asta's sensors and by the human eye. But that happened rarely. Most of the time, the crew saw blood and pain and impossible sights, and the enemy ship was the tip of a jagged sword. Machines were no better than human sensors at getting a firm impression, and the St. Asta's auspexes and sensoria struggled to interpret what they saw, the displays haunted by sensor ghosts. All any of them could be certain of was that the rift was heading for Fomor 3's star. Fionnuala could spare no more thought for it than that. The crew had more pressing matters at hand. The battle zone around Fomor 3 was crowded with Imperial ships. Giant troop haulers drew in hundreds of smaller craft, fleeing the war on the surface. A cordon of warships protected the evacuation. Poorly armed conveyors huddled the center. Groups of cruisers broke from formation to defend the transports as they fired their engines and fled, and the sphere of ships shrank, and so running battles were strung out to the system edge. Space all the way to the Mandeville point flashed with furious exchanges of fire, each skirmish separated from the next by hundreds of thousands of miles, but together added up to a display that made the void sparkle. By the time the St. Asta had fought her way into the orbit of Fomor 3, the evacuation was in full swing and was now coming to an end. The surviving troop transports were full. The shrinking Imperial fleet was coming under increased pressure as more enemy capital ships sailed in from the dark to engage them. 2 hulking Cetacea-class transit ships remained, their gaping hulls scooping up small craft. The St. Asta's strike group guarded the sunward approach. The command deck was a babble of orders and tense voices. Vox messages from all over the St. Asta, its strike group, and the wider fleet chattered over one another from the mouths of mechanical figures and wire-meshed grills. The ship shook under enemy hits, the violent flexing of its void shields passing on kinetic overspill to the structure. "Fresh contacts emerging over Fomor 3 horizon," a junior officer shouted over the clamour. 4 new targets of threat level majoris, 8 of minoris classification. "The Domitian requests immediate strike craft support," another relayed. "Denied," Fionnuala said. "Enemy bomber flight inbound on intercept course with St. Asta and coming light. All escort fighters hold to defend." Icons blinked on and disappeared from the hololiths. Tactical displays shone with an incomprehensible amount of data. Servitors mumbled flat reports detailing thousands of deaths. Fionnuala tried to concentrate, but the red slash through the sky drew her eyes back towards it. A headache pushed against her skull, and every word she read she had to read again, then again, before she understood it. An alarm wailed behind her, and she turned angrily towards the source. "Repair crews! Lock that malfunction down! I can't hear myself think up here!" The noise ceased, and she returned to her displays. The Imperial line held against the enemy, who were attacking without much in the way of discipline. They came in small groups, daring the gauntlet of fire the Imperial fleet put out. A determined spear thrust could break a protective sphere, but the enemy ships came at them in dribs, frenzied as the warriors they carried, and threw themselves heedlessly at the Imperial guns. The first of the transports closed up its docking slots and began to make hard burn away from the planet. A portion of the fleet detached and formed up around it, all painfully slowly as huge engines pushed the ship's enormous masses into action. Then the second fired up its main engine stacks, its hangar gate still open, the last of the evacuation craft chasing after it. They were successful at first, darting into the still gaping decks, but as the Cetacea accelerated, the small craft fell behind, and an extra layer of desperate Vox messages was added to the hubbub of communication. Fionnuala reread the specifics of the new enemy group. The announcement had been one of hundreds, and the group's arrival was but one piece of data pulled into the general cascade of information. But it was significant, and she saw it as a potential turning point of the battle, not necessarily in their favor. She brought up closer views and more data. The ships were hanging back around their chief vessel, a grand cruiser of an ancient sort, rarely seen in imperial navies those days. It was huge and baroquely decorated, and radiated a malice that intensified her headache while she read the augur reports. "They're going to make a push for it soon," she said. "Someone's exerting control out there. As soon as they get themselves organized, we'll be in danger." "Seen and noted, First Officer," Athagay said. Her voice was strained. Every person on the ship suffered the psychic pressure emanating from the rip in the sky. "Vox Annunciate. Pass on notification of incoming threat made by First Lieutenant Diomed to Fleet Command." "We're closest," said Fionnuala. "They'll make their run right by our noses. They'll wait until the fleet breaks up to withdraw with the last transport and come at us then." "They will." Athagay's eyes narrowed. "Do we have enough fight in us to take on a grand cruiser and its escorts? That is the question." "You'll get your answers soon, Commodore," said Fionnuala. "Admiral Trehescon is ordering a general withdrawal." She depressed her keyring, and the Admiral's face came into being in the air in front of the command dais. He was young for an Admiral, younger than Athagay, not much older than Fionnuala. He always looked immaculate. There was not a hair out of place in his beard. "All ships are to withdraw, according to plan," he said. That was it. He disappeared. The fleet had coded orders as to their withdrawal points, sub-fleet organization, emergency rendezvous, and dispersal patterns. They knew what to do. "Now is the time," said Athagay. She called down her Vox cherub and spoke into the horn it proffered. "Strike Group St. Asta. Return to tight formation, staggered line, ascending ecliptic echelon. Enact now." "Those are not the Admiral's original orders," Fionnuala said. "The enemy will attack within minutes. Our prescribed formation will see us all dead," she responded. "Aye, Commodore," said Fionnuala, who agreed with Athagay's command, but was duty-bound to point out the discrepancy. She caught the eye of the St. Asta's Commissar Navis Serenkus, prowling the gangways between the command pits. The old man blinked like a lizard and looked away. No challenge there, then. Already, the sphere surrounding the ascension corridor leading up out of Foam War 3's gravity well was breaking apart. In most cases, the ships behaved with admirable precision, and the sphere hinged outwards like an opening flower, keeping up well-coordinated volumes of fire as they repositioned. There were over 100 vessels involved, and their discipline was perfect. They split into smaller groups, moving off to several headings to confuse the foe, the grouping of ships rearranging themselves into more flexible formations as they sailed. The enemy, already disorganized, broke apart to chase down the escaping Imperial ships. Only those around the Grand Cruiser held their position. "My Lady Commodore Athagay," said Lieutenant Hainkin. He was of the third watch, one of the Deus officers, but rarely up on the platform. He had too big a heart, thought Fionnuala. He was choking on it now, his skin flushing and throat working uncomfortably. "If I may." "Don't," thought Fionnuala, but Athagay nodded her consent. "There are thousands of soldiers still on the surface," Hainkin said. "I have multiple requests for assistance from smaller craft who are out of range of the last transports, and more from the evacuation zone. We could take some on board." All eyes went to the Commodore. "Ignore them," said Athagay. "We condemn thousands to death, but such is war. Thousands die so millions might live." It was the burden people like Athagay bore. Hainkin would never understand that. The St. Asta rumbled as her engines pushed her about, swinging her stern away from the planet. A klaxon blared. "Enemy Grand Cruiser beginning attack run. All ships in attendance. Spear formation," Fionnuala ordered. "Increase port maneuvering thruster output," said Athagay. "I want us over the planet's terminator and away before we're in range of their main batteries." "They'll cut right through us if they catch us," said Fionnuala. "Then they won't catch us," said Athagay. "The enemy has launched torpedoes, full spread. Contact in 5 minutes." "They're getting damnably close," said Fionnuala. "And I say they will get no closer," said Athagay. "I have an identity," an officer reported.
Blood King.
I've heard of that, said Athagay quietly. In the oculus, the bruised surface of Fomor 3 passed by. Fionnuala watched it. Scores of lights flashed in the debris between the ship and the surface as the enemy loosed his first launch shots. Their batteries of plasma casters, fusion beams and laser cannon were out of arc, but the Grand Las weapons on their spines fired steadily. Thankfully, the debris field around the planet made targeting difficult. Fires burned all over Fomor 3's surface. A few months before, it was blue and green, a civilized world dominated by agriculture and small seas. It had been far from a paradise planet, but further from the overcrowded hells of many other imperial worlds. Now it was a necrotic brown, choking on its own blackened breath. Fionnuala had seen a planet die twice before. Each time, her feelings became more wretched at the sight. There were trillions of worlds in the galaxy. Perhaps billions of them were suitable for human habitation. The Imperium consisted of 1 million worlds, they said, but she had realized a long time ago that was a figurative number. It had no basis in reality. How could it, when so many planets burned every month? World death, she whispered. A flashing light on her command boards attracted her attention. She frowned in disbelief, never having seen that particular indicator illuminated. She pressed a button beneath it. A screen came on, displaying an Imperial badge that surprised her. She turned to the Commodore. Madam Commodore, I have a priority message on the Canulus Obligatio. Athagay looked at her sharply. The Inquisition, she said. Fionnuala nodded. Play it, snapped Athagay. The appropriate code sequence to activate the message cipher was so obscure that Fionnuala had to send for a specialist from the Vox pits. He was old, needed to retrieve a monotusk servitor from its case, which he did very slowly. Then orderlies had to be summoned to convey the servitor upon a grav sled, for it had been reduced to a head in an armoured box with a cogitator attached. The process was painfully sedate and accompanied with many solemn utterances that irritated Athagay visibly. Can you not, she said, get a bloody move on? We are under fire. Madam Commodore, unmerciful requests adjusted course heading. We're not moving as they expect, the Master of Maneuvers called. Of course we're not moving as they expect. Tell them to come about. Get the whole flotilla to come about. Helm, full starboard thrust. Leave us pointing at Fomor 3. Broadsides, prepare to fire, she commanded. We can't go anywhere until we have this message decoded. Prepare to engage enemy spearhead. We could leave, madam, said Fionnuala. We might escape with our lives, only to lose them later. The Inquisition are the agents of the Emperor, said Athagay. They will not be denied. Klaxons wailed. The ship shuddered as its own lance turrets opened up, hurling the contents of gargantuan capacitors at the approaching enemy in beams of destructive light. The enemy had recharged theirs and fired almost simultaneously. The Vox specialist arrived at the dais. The box was opened, releasing a pungent waft of decay. A copper wire was unspooled from a reel and plugged into Fionnuala's console. Now, First Officer? Fionnuala nodded. Don't you understand? Hurry up, shouted Athagay from the top of her dais. She had not taken any stims for an hour and was becoming irritable. The Vox specialist turned a crank on the outside of the box. The head came to sudden, jerky life, eyelids fluttering and jaws clacking. A series of red lumen beads lit up on the box exterior until they made a flickering line. They turned green. Code conveyed and accepted, the old man said, then bowed and began the slow process of returning the head to its locker. Fionnuala watched the cipher on her screen interact with the message code logs. Blurred lines of text ran down the glass. Then a hololith projector came on, and a phantom face appeared off to her left. He was a young man, of so serious a demeanor, it looked like he had never smiled in his life. Captain of the St. Aster, I am Inquisitor Rostov of the Ordo Xenos. By the authority of the Emperor himself, I demand immediate retrieval from the atmosphere of Fomor 3. Coordinates for intercept are included. Transponder code for my vessel included. I am en route now. For the Emperor, the Inquisitor intoned. The message snapped off. The arrogance of it, said Athagay. No doubt whatsoever we would respond. Are we going to respond? Said Fionnuala. The Commodore sighed. Her long haptic nails drummed on the arm of her throne. Of course. Send Rostov a message. Same channel. Tell him we are on our way. Fionnuala looked at the coordinates, then out at the world and the closing enemy battle fleet. Summon all my captains to hololithic conference. Message Commodore Shalung.
See if Strike Group Justicarius will cover our backs. He owes me from the Dandra debacle, Athagay said. As soon as she gave this order, small projections of her fleet masters began to appear around her. And put out a general call to those fleeing Fomor 3. We shall heed Lieutenant Hankins' craving for mercy this once. Any craft that can reach us, we will take in. But they must reach us. We cannot turn back or deviate from our course to save them. Helm, she said. New heading. Her talon wands twitched as she datacast the coordinates to the fan-shaped helm section of the deck, where it was fed via ocular implant and direct cranial feed to the helmsman. All hands stand ready. This is going to be rough. The battlesphere over Fomor 3 was awash with fire and deadly light. Strike Group St. Aster formed up with the ships of Strike Group Justicarius, presenting a block to the approaching Blood King and its escorts. Gunfire flew between the two forces with building fury. Void shield flare flashed across the fronts of both fleets. Concentrated lance fire from Shalung's ships cut apart a squadron of enemy destroyers as they neared. The Asbellus of St. Aster's group took a mauling in return from torpedoes and solid rounds cast ahead of the Chaos advance. The St. Aster took no part in the worsting battle, but drove hard down the planet's gravity well, her dorsal thrusters burning hot and main stack pushing at 70%. Her prow hit the atmosphere at close to terminal speed, striking fire from the world's gas envelope immediately. Stripes of flame trailed after her as she plunged down, her void shields reacting violently to the insult of atmospheric flight. Behind her, the Asbellus succumbed to lance fire, breaking into glittering pieces and falling after the St. Aster. Two Chaos ships left formation to chase the diving battlecruiser. The blocking Imperial force zeroed in on one and sliced it apart, its wreckage mingling with that of the Asbellus and tumbling into the atmosphere together. The other ship shrugged off the attack and plunged after the St. Aster. Bigger, heavier, and better armed, it chased the lighter ship with predatory determination. Above the glow of the void atmospheric line, the ships turned their guns away, for the Cornate force was ploughing through the joined battle groups, and the Blood King was among them, all weapons firing. Lacrante came around in confusion. For a moment he had no idea where he was. Only when the deck bounced and then pitched forward hard did he remember all that had befallen him in the last day. His head was wet with blood running from his scalp.
"Get up,"
said one of the scions, strapped into the passenger seats.
"Another fall like that and you're going to break bones. Yours I don't care about, but you could break mine, and I do care about that."
He pointed to the empty chair next to Rostov's little Xenos companion. Lacrante thought of the warrior left behind so that she could come aboard. He stared distastefully at her. She had big, flat feet with an ugly fringe of toes running most of the way around the outside. Chilka wore footwear, but it was so form-fitting it displayed the creature's revolting physiology.
"Get into the seat now,"
said another of the scions. He nudged him with a filthy boot, showing no respect for Lacrante's higher rank. Lacrante grabbed the restraints and used them to haul himself up into the seat. When he had buckled himself in, the constant bouncing of the ship was easier to bear. Blood continued to run down his face, soaking into his collar and pooling in the hollow of his collarbones. His mouth was dry and his head swam, but he ignored it, for from his position he could see past Rostov into the cramped cockpit, and from there out of the frontal canopy. The sky was a terrifying mess of explosions and destructive energies, laced by the trails of dueling attack craft. The pilot shouted something at Rostov that Lacrante didn't catch. Then the little lighter yawed to the right and brought into view an astounding sight. A warship was flying down into the atmosphere. At first he thought it was out of control and on a crash course, for it drew a long fiery line down through the sky. Black smoke flooded the atmosphere behind it. A teardrop of flickering energy trailed around it, the shields distorted and revealed by the pressure of the air. Fire wreathed it on all sides. 100 enemy craft swarmed it like the mythical hornet of ancient terror, their stings of laser fire and missile strike speckling its throbbing voids with patterns of lightning. Thick columns of lance fire flicked past it from behind, and when the Arvis moved a little more, he saw a second warship cutting another trail through Fomor 3's tortured air, and it was firing on the first. He blinked blood from his eyes. The Arvis was making its way directly to the foremost ship.
"There's our ticket away from this place. The St. Aster,"
shouted Chilka with wicked glee, following his gaze.
"Do they gamble on your world?"
said the little alien.
"Because I'd rate our odds as pretty low."
Antoniato was staring at the ceiling, mouthing prayers to the Emperor.
"Don't listen to her,"
he said, in between pleas for salvation.
She's a pessimist.
Yeah, not even this will keep his mouth closed. He doesn't like flying, you know,
said Chilka. Her Piscean face was wrinkled as tree bark, and her mouth lipless, but she was obviously smiling.
He's going to start crying. That's something I'd wager my money on.
Lacrante's head was swimming. The St. Aster wasn't crashing. It had deliberately entered the atmosphere of Fomor 3.
They're coming to rescue us,
he realized. The Arvis bounced hard, falling 100 feet, then rocketing back up again. Antoniato groaned.
That's the plan,
said Chilka.
It's a stupid plan,
she added.
Rostov's luck's run out at last. It's been a good run, though, eh, Tony?
Keep your filthy Xenos quiet,
said one of the Scions.
Don't,
said Antoniato. He gulped down a deep breath.
Don't piss her off. I've seen her go through better than you in seconds.
Chilka stuck out one of her lower arms and waved at the Scion. He was about to reply when the Arvis shook with the impact of rapid cannon fire. The pilot reacted to the attack by yanking sideways on the flight sticks, sending the ship into an ungainly barrel roll. Lacrante grabbed at the straps. The blood rushed to his head, making the throb of his cut worse. One of the enemy's dragoncraft streaked past the pilot's canopy, its scream of rage defying physics and penetrating the minds of the men aboard.
Get us aboard the ship, Rostov shouted, or the opportunity for salvation will evade our grasp.
His boots must have had magnetic locks, for he stayed attached to the deck when the craft rolled. He was commanding, focused, but his knuckles were white where they gripped the doorway, and his previously inscrutable face was wrinkled with concentration.
Go faster!
The pilot depressed her pedal. The Arvis's engines howled louder. The boxy craft was as aerodynamic as a ferrocrete block, and it struggled to increase speed, but slowly they gained on the falling ship. Another demonic screech punished the men's minds. The Draco craft dived suddenly into sight, wings folded, then spreading to slow and come right at them. Though it appeared mechanical, close to, it seemed to move more like a creature of flesh and blood than a machine, giving it a sense of wrongness Lacrante could taste. The ship beast screamed again. The Arvis pulled hard to the right to avoid it, but its wings twitched, and it matched the movement easily. In place of a tongue, a cannon was set, and it opened fire, spraying the craft with red-hot bullets. All this happened in a fraction of a second. Then it was away over them, carried off by its own speed, and the Arvis was falling. Wind blasted through a single bullet hole in the canopy. The pilot hung dead in her restraints. The shuttle veered off course, throwing them all about in their harnesses. The Draco returned to spray the lighter with more rounds. Several plunked musically through the side, killing two of the Scions in their seats.
Chilka!
Rostov shouted. He leaned into the cockpit and grabbed the sticks, but could do little other than level out the flight from his position.
On it,
Chilka said.
Hold this,
she said to Lacrante, shoving her heavy pack onto his lap. It was warm, and he had the perverse idea it was somehow alive. She smacked the restraint release with the flat of her hand and leapt onto the floor, sure-footedly, scampering into the cockpit. She hauled the pilot's corpse out, dragged it into the passenger compartment, and hopped into the seat, all without losing her balance once.
Hand it over,
she said. Rostov relinquished the controls.
Should have let me fly in the first place,
she shouted over the wind whistling through the cockpit hole. The Arvis pulled up again, accelerating now as Chilka's secondary arms raced over the switches.
God's damned human technology,
she said loudly.
So unresponsive.
The St. Aster's burning hull was close ahead. The Draco craft sped past again. This time it reached out with metallic claws to snatch the shuttle from the sky, but Chilka jinked at the last moment, and the creature hurtled past with an outraged scream.
Call the ship, Leonid. Tell them we're on a fast approach,
she said.
We need some covering fire, or we'll not make it. This ship you found us is a lump of crap. It'll never outrun a Helldrake. They have to get it off our back.
Rostov took the Xenos' insolence without comment and spoke into his vox. The words were lost in the violence of the battle, but they were heard, for a few seconds later the Arvis was speeding through a storm of las cannon beams as thick as horizontal rain. Despite the danger, the Helldrake kept up its pursuit.
Damn thing still on my tail,
said Chilka. With the las beams coming at them, Chilka had to keep the Arvis on a more or less straight course to avoid being hit, making it easier for the Helldrake to target them.
and I'm going to have to close the blast screen, she said.
The wreath of fire around the ship filled the sky in front of the Arvis. Chilka keyed the shutters closed as they approached, and they flew blind into it. There was a roar as they passed through the fires, then a bone-deep ache as they flew on through the void shields. Chilka had her eyes firmly on a small nav screen in the Arvis's dashboard. The Arvis dropped to the sound of a loud bang. Molten metal dripped from a hole in the upper hull, and wind roared in. A terrifying rush of sensations followed. Nothing could be heard over the blast of the wind through the hole in the ceiling. Another impact smashed the craft down. The Arvis heeled to one side. A steel talon pushed through the hull, followed by a second as the Helldrake tightened its hold on the shuttle. Chilka was shouting. The Scions began firing. The compartment filled with the smell of las-burned air and hot metal. The engines howled with the effort of keeping the craft aloft while the Helldrake attempted to force it down to the ground. The Helldrake screamed again, and this time the pressure within Lacrante's mind was so great he screamed back. Images of parched landscapes cut by rivers of gore, where vast armies warred eternally over prizes of bone, forced themselves into his mind, and the stink of spilled guts and fresh blood filled his nose. The ship lurched. Then there was a bone-cracking impact. Part of the Arvis's wall punched in, and its belly caught on something. They were sliding on a solid surface. Tortured metal screeches joined with the Helldrake's cries. Abruptly, all stopped in a tremendous crash. Lacrante might have passed out again. When he came to, the lighter was tilted at 45 degrees. The ramp wrenched open, its damaged pistons spraying hydraulic fluid everywhere. The smell of spilt promethium choked him, and dangerous vapors gathered in shifting clouds. The Scions were running out, charging their hell guns. Antoniato was with them, his plasma gun cycling up to fire. Rostov and Chilka went after. "Move!" the Inquisitor shouted. Groggily, Lacrante obeyed, slapping open his restraints and lugging Chilka's pack out. The Arvis shuddered and lifted as he ran down the ramp. They were in a hangar. On the other side of the atmospheric field, the fires and void shield discharge continued, but the view was narrowing as heavy shutters ground closed over the aperture. The Arvis had ploughed a steel furrow into the deck, dotted with puddles of burning fuel, smashed through a supply tender, knocked another lighter aside, and come to rest against the hangar wall. Men were running all over the hangar, racing to put out the growing blaze, but fire was the least of their worries, for pinned beneath the squat body of the Arvis, the Helldrake still lived, and it was alive not in the abstract way the tech priest said, but shrieking, bleeding, thrashing life, straining against the weight pinning it down. Its claws scrabbled the plating beneath it to ribbons. One of its wings was smashed into scrap, and it leaked blood, not oil. It lived. The Scions were firing. Overcharged lasbolts punched into its side, bringing forth more dark vitae. The Helldrake vomited searing bullets across the ceiling, unable to twist its neck around. Lacrante drew his own pistol, but against such a monster he had no idea if his modest weapon would do any good. Chilka brought out her strange rifle and put a glowing bullet into the thing's eye, but still it screamed, until Antoniato's gun whined loudly and its machine spirit chimed readiness to fire.